Hello. Since January 1974, a series of attacks on women have taken place in the Seattle area of Washington state. The suspect, wearing a mask, would sneak into the homes of young women late at night. He would use a club to knock them unconscious before assaulting them. Over the course of 6 months, almost every month, several girls were reported missing. The suspect gradually expanded his range of activity. What began as robberies and assaults escalated into murders. The victims were predominantly young, beautiful women, mostly college students with long hair parted in the middle. The suspect always wore a mask during his crimes and meticulously cleaned up the crime scenes, making it difficult for police investigations to progress. By June 1974, late one night, a girl named Jordan Hawken vanished in an alley while walking home. The next day, police searched the alley thoroughly but found no trace of her. Witnesses reported seeing a man with a cane at the location where she disappeared that night. The man was carrying a briefcase and had his leg in a cast. Due to limited leads, the police couldn't track him down. Jordan's family included a journalist who, upon learning of the incident, published articles that drew public attention. It turned out that over the past 6 months, a string of young women had gone missing in Seattle, causing widespread fear among locals. The police compiled information on some of the missing women and noticed that their disappearances coincided with university exam periods in the area. Most of the disappearances occurred near construction sites, and several witnesses reported seeing a man with a cast on his leg driving a Volkswagen Beetle. Given the similarities in the cases, the police suspected the same perpetrator was responsible. On July 14, 1974, a month later, 5 young women were relaxing on the beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington. A handsome man dressed in a white tennis outfit approached them. One of his arms was bandaged, and he introduced himself to the girls as Ted. Claiming his injury prevented him from managing alone, he asked the 5 of them to help him carry a sailboat from his car. 4 of them declined, but a 23-year-old girl eagerly agreed to assist. She followed him to his car, only to discover there was no sailboat. Having heard about the recent string of disappearances in the area, she sensed something was wrong and quickly turned to run toward a crowded area. Her vigilance saved her life. That same day, 2 other girls were reported missing from the park. Multiple witnesses saw a suspicious man with a bandaged arm. The police created a sketch of the suspect based on their descriptions and posted it across Seattle streets. They received hundreds of tips daily, one of which pointed to the same suspect, Ted Bundy, a 28-year-old local university student with excellent grades and no criminal record. 8 witnesses from that day at the park were shown photos of Ted, but 7 out of 8 said it wasn't him. The police also reasoned that someone like Ted was unlikely to commit such crimes, and with no solid evidence, they let him go. In reality, during his high school years, Ted had been arrested multiple times for theft, though those records were inexplicably expunged when he became an adult. Sometime later, a hiker reported to the police that he had found a skeleton 3 kilometers from Lake Sammamish State Park. After receiving the report, police searched the area and discovered 2 more skeletons, a total of 3. They confirmed that these were the remains of recently missing girls, one of whom was Jordan, the missing university student. Following the series of cases in Seattle, more women began disappearing in Salt Lake City, Utah. 2 girls' bodies were found naked in a forest on a mountainside, covered in bruises and showing signs of assault, possibly post-mortem. The cause of death was strangulation. The suspect was extremely cautious, leaving the crime scene spotless, which left police with few clues. At the time, police departments across different U.S. states didn't share information, so they didn't realize that the consecutive incidents in Seattle, Washington, and those in Salt Lake City, Utah, were committed by the same person. On November 8, 1974, under a light rain, a girl burst into a Salt Lake City police station to report crime. Her name was Carol Duranch, an 18-year-old telephone operator. She explained that after work that day, she had planned to drive to a bookstore to read. A handsome man approached her, claiming to be a police officer. He told her someone was trying to steal her car. Carol wasn't sure how he'd found her, but she decided to follow him to the parking lot. On the way, she grew suspicious and asked to see his ID. He just smiled and brushed her off. When they reached the lot, Carol saw her car was indeed missing. The man suggested it might have been towed and urged her to go with him to a nearby security post to file a report. After hesitating, Carol, anxious to recover her car, went with him to a remote building, but there was no car in sight. The man then claimed it might have been taken to the police station and offered to drive her there. On the way, Carol noticed they weren't heading toward the station. Sensing danger, she demanded to be let out. The man slowed the car, then suddenly grabbed her arm, pulled a gun, pointed it at her head, and threatened to kill her. Carol managed to fling the door open, jump out, and run. Just then, a car drove by. She flagged it down and begged the driver to take her to the police station to report the incident. After some investigation, police identified several suspects, including Ted Bundy. Carol immediately recognized him from photos of the suspects, heightening police suspicion. Back in Washington, police received a tip from Elizabeth Klopfer, Ted Bundy's girlfriend. This wasn't her first report. Months earlier, she had alerted them about a disappearance at Lake Sammamish State Park, but they hadn't taken it seriously. After hearing about the Salt Lake City incidents, she again pointed the finger at Ted. This time, police launched an investigation into him and found that his travel patterns matched the locations of the disappearances. Beyond that, however, they had no concrete evidence. On August 16, 1975, while patrolling, a Utah police officer spotted a Volkswagen Beetle moving slowly and suspiciously through a residential area. When the driver noticed the patrol car, he abruptly turned and tried to flee, but was quickly stopped. Inside, police found the passenger seat removed, along with a ski mask, a crowbar, handcuffs, rope, and other tools. The driver was Ted Bundy. He claimed the ski mask was for skiing, the handcuffs were something he'd found in a dumpster, and the rest were just everyday items. He said he was heading to a movie that night. Skeptical of his story, the officer called it in. Learning Ted was linked to several major cases, they brought him to the station. Investigators searched his residence, but found nothing incriminating. Due to lack of evidence, Ted was released. Washington police compiled detailed files on all the recently missing girls and listed Ted Bundy among the suspects. Born in November 1946 as Theodore Cowell, Ted's mother had him out of wedlock. His father abandoned them, and her strict Christian family disapproved of unwed mothers. After giving birth at a home for unwed mothers, she left Ted there. Unable to bear seeing his grandson in that situation, Ted's grandfather took him to their Philadelphia home and raised him as a son to shield him from gossip. Ted grew up believing his grandfather was his father. His grandfather was violent, paranoid, and deeply racist, often using force to solve problems. Under his influence, Ted exhibited odd behaviors as a child, like placing a knife by sleeping family members and smiling with satisfaction. His grandfather enjoyed pornography and left magazines scattered around, which young Ted often browsed. In 1950, when Ted was 4, his mother took him from Philadelphia to Western Washington. A year later, in 1951, she married a man and had 4 more children. Ted struggled to fit into this new family. In high school, he was withdrawn and antisocial, often wandering alone, rummaging through trash for discarded pornographic magazines, or peeking into women's homes at night to watch them bathe. He also enjoyed crime novels and detective stories. In 1965, at 19, Ted enrolled at the University of Puget Sound south of Seattle, then transferred to the University of Washington in central Seattle. There, he began dating Stephanie Brooks, a girl from a wealthy family. Her family didn't approve of Ted, prompting him to drop out of college. He worked as a driver and bodyguard for government agencies, aspiring to a political career. But young and impatient, Ted craved quick success. Stephanie found him immature, and with her family's disapproval, she ended the relationship. The breakup devastated Ted, marking a turning point in his life. Reeling from the split, Ted grew curious about his origins and investigated his past. To his shock, he discovered the man who raised him was his grandfather. This double blow, rejection and a fractured identity, pushed him into a tailspin. To cope, he traveled to Colorado and beyond. In the fall of 1969, at 23, Ted returned to Washington and began dating Elizabeth Klopfer, a 24-year-old single mother. The next year, he re-enrolled at the University of Washington, studying psychology. With a high IQ and stellar grades, he earned praise from professors. After graduating, Ted worked at a Seattle crisis hotline, where he met and Rule, a former cop-turned-writer, and a colleague named Andrew. They shared police tactics with him, knowledge that later fueled his crimes. Revitalized, Ted re-entered politics, helping the governor defeat rivals and launching a brief political career. By 1973, at 27, he enrolled in law school at the University of Puget Sound on the governor's and professors' recommendations. Charismatic and ambitious, Ted seemed destined for greatness. He reconnected with Stephanie, who was impressed by his transformation. They rekindled their romance, though Ted kept his relationship with Elizabeth ongoing, with neither woman aware of the other. After dating Stephanie for a while, Ted proposed. She joyfully accepted and introduced him as her fiancé. But just as they planned their wedding, Ted abruptly cut off all contact. Stephanie couldn't reach him, leaving her heartbroken. It was all a calculated move, Ted's revenge for their earlier breakup. Back in 1969, Elizabeth, then 24, met Ted in a bar near the university. They hit it off, spending the night together. The next morning, Ted cooked her breakfast, charming her deeply. They grew close. Ted was kind to her daughter, often coming home early on weekends to care for her like a father. Elizabeth came from a wealthy Utah family. Her father was a dentist. After dating a while, she brought Ted to meet them. His polished demeanor won them over. Ashamed of his own troubled past, Ted grew determined to climb the social ladder through politics or prestige. Over their 5 years together, Elizabeth got pregnant once while Ted was still in school. To avoid derailing his studies, she had an abortion. Later, she discovered Ted was seeing other women behind her back. To spite him, she dated someone else, hoping to make him jealous. Ted didn't care. Defeated, she turned to alcohol but couldn't bring herself to leave him. In early 1974, as women began disappearing in Seattle, police released a suspect sketch to the public. Elizabeth thought it resembled Ted. At the time, he wasn't living with her but renting a nearby house, convenient for his crimes. After 2 disappearances, she grew suspicious and asked where he'd been those days. His vague, hesitant answers unsettled her. The police description mentioned a Volkswagen Beetle, the same car Ted drove. By chance, Elizabeth found crutches, a bag of plaster, and a sack of women's underwear in his car and home. Desperate for the truth, she confronted him. Ted coldly threatened her, saying he wouldn't spare her if she told anyone. Still, she confided in a close friend, who urged her to call the police. With only her word and no hard evidence, amid a flood of similar tips, police initially brushed it off. In 1975, Ted moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, where another woman was attacked. Elizabeth couldn't chalk it up to coincidence and reported him again. This time, police visited her, asking detailed questions. Based on recent cases, they suspected the perpetrator had a severe paraphilia. They probed Elizabeth about Ted's intimate habits. She revealed his unusual desires and interest in related literature, further fueling their suspicions. The next step was finding proof. In September 1975, Ted sold his Beetle. Acting on a tip, police seized it and conducted a thorough search. They found multiple hair strands, which forensic analysis matched to 3 victims: Melissa Smith, Karen Campbell, and Carol Duranch, the woman who'd reported her ordeal earlier. Melissa vanished in Utah and was found days later, bruised, bludgeoned, and assaulted. Karen, a nurse, disappeared on vacation in Colorado and was found a month later, naked and battered on a remote road, also assaulted. Though the crimes spanned different locations, the hair linked them to Ted's car. Washington police began coordinating with other states. After sharing case details, they realized the crimes across multiple regions were likely the work of one man, Ted Bundy. Armed with critical evidence, they arrested him. Ted denied everything, insisting he was innocent. The prosecution's evidence was thin. Hair alone wouldn't guarantee a conviction, so they charged him with kidnapping instead. In February 1976, the case went to trial. Carol Duranch testified, confidently identifying Ted as her would-be abductor. Coupled with the hair evidence, the court convicted Ted Bundy of kidnapping, sentencing him to 15 years. Post-verdict, prosecutors pursued 2 first-degree murder charges for Melissa and Karen. Ted was extradited to Colorado for trial. On June 7, 1977, at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Colorado, Ted requested to act as his own attorney, a motion the judge granted, freeing him from handcuffs and shackles. Such serious cases often required multiple lengthy hearings. During a break, Ted went to the second-floor library to research, wandering among the shelves. When no one was watching, he bolted to a window and jumped. He twisted his ankle but could still walk. After escaping, he headed south through the Aspen Mountains, stealing food, clothes, and a rifle from a cabin before venturing deeper into the wilderness. 2 days later, he reached Maroon Lake, taking more supplies from a camper before pressing on. By June 13, 1977, 6 days on the run, the cold and his worsening injury overwhelmed him. He stole a car and drove back to Aspen for treatment, but was spotted and arrested by patrol officers. He was taken to Garfield County Jail. His lawyers and friends argued the prosecution's evidence couldn't prove his guilt. If he stayed calm, he might walk free. But Ted, well-versed in law, had his own plan, another escape. Knowing it'd be tough alone, he enlisted Carol Boone, an old co-worker who had long been smitten with him. During a prison visit, she slipped him drugs, which he sold to another inmate for $500. With the cash, he bought a hacksaw and a jail layout. Using daily shower time, he sawed a hole in his cell's ceiling, accessing a ventilation shaft. It was too narrow for his frame, so he crash-dieted, losing 35 pounds. Nightly, he climbed into the ducts to map a route. Other inmates heard noises and alerted guards, who dismissed it as rats. Ted couldn't find an exit, but located the jailer's office, sparking a new idea. On December 30th, 1977, a lax Christmas season day with many guards off, 31-year-old Ted executed his escape. He stacked books on his bunk, draped a blanket over them to mimic a sleeping figure, then climbed into the ceiling vent. Moving cautiously to avoid detection, he reached the jailer's office, donned a guard uniform, and strolled out the front door. By noon the next day, guards discovered his absence. By then, Ted was in Chicago. After his breakout, the FBI launched a nationwide manhunt. Ted stayed briefly in Chicago before heading to Florida. He rented a room near Florida State University, aiming to blend in and find work. Unable to use his real identity, he resorted to theft. Soon, he resumed assaulting and killing young, attractive women in the area. On February 12, 1978, over a month after his escape, penniless and evicted, Ted stole another car and fled. 3 days later, on February 15, 1978, in the early morning, police stopped him. Inside, they found IDs of multiple female students, stolen credit cards, and a stolen TV. In 1979, at 33, Ted faced trial in Florida. To maintain a positive image with the jury, he had Carol Boone, a single mother infatuated with him, testify falsely on his behalf. She believed him innocent. The prosecution's evidence was shaky, so they offered a plea deal, confessed to 3 murders, and apologized to the families, avoiding the death penalty. Ted saw it as a stall tactic, hoping to exploit legal loopholes later. He apologized to the victims' families, but rejected the deal. In June 1979, the trial began, drawing massive media attention. Witnesses testified to seeing Ted with murder weapons and at crime scenes. Bite marks on one victim's left buttock matched Ted's teeth perfectly, per forensic experts. After over a month, on July 24, 1979, the court convicted Ted Bundy of 2 counts of first-degree murder, sentencing him to death. The case rocked the nation, captivating the public. Handsome and charming, Ted had fans who couldn't believe he was guilty. Some even sent him love letters and gifts in prison. In January 1980, another murder trial tied to Ted opened in Orlando. Supporters flocked from across the U.S., passing love notes to his defense team. Ted became a celebrity. One female fan told reporters he seemed incapable of such horrors. Notably, during the trial, Ted proposed to Carol Boone in front of the judge. She'd learned of a quirky Florida law. A proposal before a judge could legalize a marriage. She'd urged Ted to do it for a stronger bond, though prison officials had denied earlier requests. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty, and he received another death sentence. While awaiting execution, Carol visited often, bribing guards for private time with Ted. She got pregnant. Ted began a decade-long appeal process. In an interview, he spoke cautiously, framing his early crimes in the third person. Initially motivated by theft, he said his urges later drove him to kill to silence victims. He consulted an FBI profiler and a biographer, who were stunned by his glee recounting the murders. Ted called himself an amateur at first, claiming 1974 marked a shift to serial killing, though he withheld specifics. In July 1984, guards found 2 hacksaw blades hidden in Ted's cell, suspecting another escape attempt. They discovered a window bar sawed and reattached with homemade soap glue. He was moved. Months later, they found contraband mirrors, prompting another transfer. In October 1984, investigator Robert Keppel, a key figure in Ted's case, began probing the Green River Killer. Ted, learning of it, analyzed the killer's psychology in a letter profiling the suspect to aid police, hoping to dodge execution. By 1986, his execution was set for January 1989. Appeals exhausted, evidence mounted. He could have avoided death with the earlier plea, but it was too late. Ted confessed to all his crimes, refusing details to delay his fate. Supporter Diana Weiner rallied victims' families to plead with Florida's governor, but they refused, demanding his swift execution. The governor agreed, condemning Ted's backers. Ted hadn't confessed to at least 30 murders until facing death. The night before his execution, he reviewed victims with police: 11 in Washington, 3 unidentified; 8 in Utah, 3 unidentified; 3 in Colorado; 3 in Florida; 2 in Oregon, both unidentified; 2 in Idaho, 1 unidentified; and 1 in California, unidentified. Notable cases included late January 4th, 1974, when Ted broke into 18-year-old Karen Sparks' basement apartment, beat her unconscious with a metal rod from her bed frame, and assaulted her with it, causing severe internal injuries. She survived unconscious for 10 days, with lifelong scars. Early February 1st, 1974, he invaded student Linda and Healy's room, a radio announcer, knocked her out, dressed her in jeans, a white blouse, and shoes, and abducted her. On August 8th, 1974, he assaulted and strangled a hitchhiker in Idaho, dumping her in a nearby river. On October 2nd, 1974, he kidnapped 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, near Salt Lake City, burying her near Capitol Reef National Park. On October 31st, 1974, he abducted 17-year-old Laura Am from a cafe, dumping her body in American Fork Canyon. At 7:16 a.m. on January 24th, 1989, 42-year-old Ted Bundy was executed in Florida State Prison's electric chair, ending his reign of terror. Hundreds gathered across from the prison, cheering, singing, and setting off fireworks in celebration of the monster's death. His supporters mourned. Some female fans suffered breakdowns. Of the 3 women closest to him, Stephanie married someone else after his revenge. Elizabeth, seeing his true nature post-arrest, quickly remarried. Carol, realizing she'd been deceived after his confession, took her kids and went into hiding. Ted's saga inspired countless films over decades. Ironically, despite murdering so many women, he became America's most admired serial killer among some women. From a criminological psychology perspective, Ted Bundy exemplifies a chilling blend of charisma and psychopathy. His ability to charm victims, manipulate relationships, and evade capture stem from a high IQ and a fractured upbringing, marked by rejection, identity crises, and exposure to violence and pornography. His escalation from petty crime to sadistic murder reflects a need for control and revenge, fueled by deep-seated rage and entitlement. His meticulous planning and adaptability highlight a calculating mind, while his public persona masked a predatory nature, making him a textbook study in the duality of evil. Thank you, and see you next time. Goodbye.